The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. I think we're ready to get started. So first off, I want to thank all of you for registering for this incredibly timely Dial Connection webinar produced by Inside ARM, Mobile Strategies in the Ever-Changing Age of Compliance. We have a variety of male voices on today's webinar, so I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our presenters. Mark Brennan is a partner at Hogan Lovells. His practice encompasses communications and consumer protection with a particular focus on the legal frameworks applicable to digital and mobile platforms, international telecommunications regulations, and mobile financial services. Mark has substantial experience assisting clients with complex consumer protection issues that span multiple fora, including the Federal Communications Commission, Federal Trade Commission, NTIA, Congress, state authorities, and state and federal courts. Peter Gazzelli is Vice President, U.S. Emerging Markets for TransUnion and a seasoned executive in the financial services industry with expertise in business development, finance, personnel, training program management, compliance, information technology, and operations. His 20-year track record of leadership in establishing successful programs and directing operations span credit lending, risk management, collections, and global information organizations. Michael Vesper founded Dial Connection, and in addition to his role as president and CEO, Michael serves as chief visionary and architect of Dial Connection's contact center solutions. Michael combined his technical savvy and more than 20 years of working with contact centers to develop one of the most innovative and cost-effective solutions available in the market today. Michael is driven by his passion to deliver the best possible product and service experience for Dial Connection's clients. And finally, hi, I am Mike Bevel, an editor here at InsideARM.com. So I have a few pieces of housekeeping to get through. So the first one is please note the questions box available to you. All of your mics have been muted, however, you can send your questions via this chat box at any time during the presentation. So some of these we're going to answer during the presentation, some we'll stay for the Q&A at the end, and some we won't be able to get to, but we're going to do our best. And another note that I'll mention one other time before we end this introduction is in between each of our presenters, we're going to take a couple of questions right at that point. So when you have questions specific to Mark's presentation, we'll go through two of those, specific to Peter's and then specific to Michael's. This question comes up quite a lot. You will be receiving follow-up materials like, for instance, this recorded webinar from Dial Connection within a week or so of today's presentation. I know that ACA Shindig is next week, and a lot of you will be networking there. Please make sure that you take a few minutes to complete the survey after this webinar ends. The information is incredibly valuable to us as webinar producers, and we value your thoughts and opinions very much. Also in this survey, there will be a space for you to ask any additional questions that we did not cover in the webinar or get to in the Q&A. Ask it there, and someone will get back to you. The final bit of housekeeping that I need to get through is this legalese that I will read through on the record. This information shared in this webinar is not intended to be legal advice, but simply informed opinion from a panel. It may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area, however, nor should it be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. Again, we will be taking questions in between each of the sections, but then we will do a robust Q&A at the end. And now that we have done all of that, I'm going to turn things over to Mark Brennan. Mark?
Thanks, Mike. And just to confirm, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to be here to talk with you about the latest developments and technology solutions in this space. Just as a bit of background for my section, I plan to discuss just a very brief introduction on the TCPA. I know many of you are familiar, so we won't dwell on that, but a little bit of background on the TCPA, as well as the automatic telephone dialing restriction and pre-recorded voice restrictions, as well as some information about the recent FCC declaratory ruling and order that the Commission voted on back on June 18th and released last Friday. So with that, let me dig in and we'll move forward. The TCPA, as many of you know, was passed by Congress in 1991. At the time, the legislature was concerned specifically with curbing aggressive telemarketing practices. And there were three areas of concern. The first was using automatic dialing equipment to make unsolicited calls to random or sequential telephone numbers. The second was a practice in which parties would call sequential telephone numbers in a way that tied up a block of telephone numbers and created potential public safety risks. And then third, there were concerns about some telemarketers shifting calling costs to wireless consumers. The TCPA imposes a number of restrictions on telemarketing calls, faxes, and other outbound communications. Some of those restrictions apply not only to telemarketing calls, but also to non-telemarketing calls. And the TCPA is implemented by the Federal Communications Commission. There are two provisions that have become increasingly critical from an organizational perspective with respect to compliance. The first is what we think of as the wireless restriction, and the second is the landline or residential number restriction. The wireless restriction under the TCPA states that parties must obtain prior express consent before placing any auto-dialed or pre-recorded or artificial voice calls to wireless telephone numbers. Again, the only exception is an emergency. So if a call is auto-dialed or pre-recorded and is being sent to a wireless telephone number, and certain other telephone lines, patient rooms, hospital rooms, emergency numbers, and so forth, if auto-dialed or pre-recorded and placed to a wireless telephone number, you need prior express consent, unless it's an emergency. This restriction applies regardless of the content of the call, and the FCC and some courts have determined that this restriction applies not only to voice calls, but also to text or short message service SMS messages. The FCC in 2012 added some additional written consent requirements on top of the general prior express consent requirement whenever parties are placing auto-dialed or pre-recorded marketing calls to wireless telephone numbers. So that's the wireless restriction. If auto-dialed or pre-recorded to wireless, you need prior express consent. And if it's marketing, you need prior express written consent. The landline restriction is more permissive. It does not restrict auto-dialed calls, but instead restricts pre-recorded artificial calls to residential telephone numbers. This restriction only applies to pre-recorded calls, but also only to marketing calls. And consistent with those 2012 changes, if it's a pre-recorded call to a residential or landline phone, you need prior express written consent for marketing calls. There are some exceptions, but ultimately that's the core of that restriction. So with that in mind, a number of parties have asked the FCC over the last few years to clarify some of the unsettled issues in the TCPA. And on Friday, the Commission released a declaratory ruling and order that sought to address a number of those issues. Much of the text in the 80-plus page ruling is what we call a clarification or a declaratory ruling, and then the remainder of it, which refers to the sections on exemptions to these requirements, are instead prospective or forward-looking exemptions. But the bulk of the order that we'll talk about today, the declaratory ruling effect, procedurally, what's happening there is that the FCC is intending to clarify the statute or clarify its own rules or the application of those rules. As a result, for any of those pieces of the order, the decision is effective immediately and has retroactive effect. So I want to talk about a few of the issues, a few of the bigger issues that are discussed in Friday's decision. And I mean, there are any number of issues that we could go into, but these are sort of the big ones. And I want to say at the outset that there are many instances where this order uses opaque language, appears contradictory on its face, and raises some concerns. So I will mention at the outset that there have already been 3 parties that have appealed this decision to court. 2 of those appeals have been filed in the D.C. Circuit and 1 in the 7th Circuit, and we expect more appeals to be filed. With that said, the order remains in effect. There's been no stay by the FCC or any court. So the first issue I want to talk about is the section of the order that discusses and tries to clarify the contours of the ATDS, or Automatic Telephone Dialing System, definition. So as many of you may be all too familiar, the TCPA defines an autodialer, or automatic telephone dialing system, as equipment which has the capacity to store or produce telephone numbers to be called using a random or sequential number generator and to dial such numbers. And what the FCC said in the order was that the test for whether equipment qualifies as an autodialer is whether it has the capacity to store or produce and dial random or sequential numbers. The Commission reiterated that the capacity of an autodialer is not limited to its current configuration, but also includes its potential functionalities. So in this decision, they sought to focus on the word capacity in the definition. The Commission rejected arguments by petitioners that it should adopt a standard requiring that the equipment have the present ability at the time of the calls to store or produce telephone numbers to be called using a random sequential number generator. It also confirmed that predictive dialers, as commonly understood, all qualify as autodialers. This ruling is not limited to any specific type of equipment, and it applies regardless of what the equipment may be called for marketing purposes. Unfortunately, the Commission did not describe in detail what specific type or degree of modification would be necessary for a device lacking the present ability at the time of the call to satisfy the definition of an autodialer. In other words, the Commission included language that said some level of modification might be allowed and the device would still be considered an autodialer, but it didn't make clear where that line is. The only safe harbors the Commission provided were exceptionally unhelpful. It found that a rotary phone could not be an autodialer, and it also stated that a handset with the mere addition of a speed dial button would not be an autodialer. Although equipment arguably could possess the requisite capacity if it requires the addition of software to actually perform the functions described in the autodialer statutory definition, there must be more than a theoretical potential. The Commission confirmed that there must be more than a theoretical potential that the equipment could be modified to satisfy the definition. And that's where it brought in the concept of the rotary phone. Rotary phones can theoretically be modified to autodial, but that possibility is too attenuated according to the Commission, which again, this is largely unhelpful when trying to think of this in terms of practical solutions available today. The Commission expressly declined to state where the line is between potential capacity and theoretical potential. So potential capacity appears to be covered, and theoretical potential is not covered. And apparently this will be left for the courts to decide, or to have the order vacated and go back to the Commission for a redo. The FCC also noted that the basic functions of an autodialer are to dial numbers without human intervention and to dial thousands of numbers in a short period of time. How the human intervention element applies to a particular piece of equipment, however, the Commission said is specific to each individual piece of equipment based on how the equipment functions and depends on human intervention, and is therefore a case-by-case determination. The Commission also confirmed that parties cannot avoid the consent requirements by dividing ownership of the dialing equipment. If two entities working together are collectively using technology that would otherwise qualify as an autodialer if it was combined in a single technology, the Commission noted that that would tend to be considered an autodialer as well. So again, as I mentioned, this is a very convoluted piece of the order. Parties have already appealed it, and there remains a lot of gray area as to the types of equipment that would trigger the requirements and those that are closer to speed dialing or equipment that is closer to a handset with the mere addition of speed dialing. The second big issue that the Commission addressed in the order is the reassigned numbers or wrong number issue. And here, the the challenge had come up before the Commission as to what extent parties should be liable if they do everything they're supposed to be doing under the statute and obtaining prior express consent to call an individual. But by the time they call that individual, the number's been reassigned to another subscriber. Parties have been sued in litigation, including class action litigation, based on the argument that the new subscriber had not consented to receive calls from that party. And a number of entities had argued to the Commission that this can't be the right outcome, in large part because there's no way to know and avoid all reassigned number calls. The solutions that are available today are increasingly helpful, but at the time these petitions were filed, there was not a solution that could help prevent all calls to reassign numbers. Well, the end result of this, the end result of this decision is that parties now have an extra burden and incentive to do everything they can to be avoiding calls to reassign numbers and to be able to identify the number reassignments and the number ports as soon as they can. In this decision, the Commission states that callers are liable for auto-dialed or pre-recorded calls to reassign wireless numbers when the current or new subscriber has not consented. They take the position that best practices can facilitate the detection of the reassignment before too many calls are made. They also rejected arguments that called party should mean the intended recipient of the call. However, they agreed with industry that there was no perfect solution at the time, and as a result, the scenario that they created was a one free call or one free text approach. And under that approach, as long as you've obtained the requisite consent to dial a specific telephone number, the first call that you make to that telephone number after the reassignment does not expose you to liability. And then after that first call, there's strict liability according to the Commission for the second and later calls. What's important to understand here is how the Commission interpreted call in this context. Specifically, it does not have to be an answered call or a call in which you reach a voice message, voicemail, or have other correspondence and feedback from the individual. It's more like an attempt. So the Commission confirmed that you can make one attempt, but that attempt gives you, or according to the Commission, gives you constructive knowledge. Now, there's an element of the ridiculous here, and we understand that, because there are many messages and calls where they're intended to be one way, and you would have no reason to think about a reassignment unless you had actually connected with the subscriber. With that said, this is where the Commission decided that the one free attempt or one free call it would be the solution going forward. And the way the Commission presented it was that it was a step above complete strict liability, given that industry could not avoid these calls entirely. But again, as you can see, it really puts the impetus on the individual caller to do everything it can to keep its number, its calling list accurate, up to date, to identify ports, to engage in a number of best practices, and to use technological solutions to help reduce the potential for a call to reassign numbers. And as we understand it, originally the draft language on this decision would have allowed for 3 calls to a reassigned number, and would also have allowed for some type of interaction before triggering the liability. But again, that's not where the Commission's ultimate decision landed. Another item to mention is the ability of the consumer to revoke his or her prior express consent. The Commission confirmed that consumers may revoke consent at any time through any reasonable means, and that the caller cannot limit the manner in which revocation can occur. As an example, and the Commission acknowledged that what was reasonable would depend on the circumstances and would depend on the relationship that the consumer has with the caller. But consumers generally may revoke, for example, by way of a consumer-initiated call, directly in response to a call initiated or made by a caller, or at an in-store bill payment location, among other possibilities. That's the language from the order at paragraph 64. And then finally, number porting was also addressed in the order. And the Commission confirmed that porting a telephone number from wireline to wireless does not revoke prior express consent, and that it's the consumer's responsibility to revoke that consent. However, this does not relieve callers of the obligation to comply with the prior express consent requirement for wireless numbers. So, if a caller did not obtain prior express consent for a type of call to the number when it was a residential line because no prior express consent was required, such as a caller that obtained consent only for pre-recorded calls, and then the number switched to wireless, the Commission confirmed that that caller would still have to obtain new consent to cover the auto-dialed calls. Now, as a practical matter, most parties obtain consent broadly for auto-dialed or pre-recorded, but that's something for parties to review now in light of this order, to the extent you've had any concerns about the consents in light of consumers' ability to port from wireline to wireless. There are other parts of the order that have interest to a number of industry sectors. For example, there's a going forward exemption for certain healthcare calls. There's a going forward exemption for certain financial services calls that are viewed as time sensitive. There are also some clarifications for one-time text messages in which parties are allowed to send a one-time, only one, text message in response to a consumer's request for a text message. And the archetype here is anytime a consumer sees a sign that says, text certain numbers, text to a 5-digit, text a catchphrase to a 5-digit short code to get a free coupon for that store. That is allowed and not subject to those prior express written consent requirements that the Commission adopted in 2012. So with that, let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Sure. Hey, Mark, I've got two that I'd like to throw to you right now. And as I said, we're going to in between each section, each presenter will answer a couple of questions, and then we will do a robust Q&A of the rest of the questions that have come in at the end. But the first one is more of it's looking for your opinion. How do the pending appeals affect the FCC's order, if at all? And do you have a sense, just as someone who's been paying attention, to what that success might be with some of those appeals?
Certainly. The appeal filings by themselves do not impact the effectiveness of the order, and by that I mean it went into effect immediately upon release. So the filing of an appeal by itself does not stay the effectiveness. Parties may follow up with a request to the FCC for a stay, or the parties that filed the appeals in court might ask the court to stay the effectiveness, but none have been filed at this point. I think practically speaking, it's possible that the FCC may be looking to obtain further clarity from the court before it handles similar pending petitions on these issues that have been filed. It addressed more than 20 industry-side petitions here in this order, but there are also a number of others that are still pending, and so I think the Commission will likely wait for these appeals to go through before it takes up another omnibus decision like this one.
All right. And then I think maybe every question that has happened can be summed up with this one. How will the TCPA ruling affect debt collecting companies that are using autodialers to call consumers? Do you see that we're just going to have to bid goodbye to all of our autodialers, or what is your sense? Again, not as legal advice, but just as someone with an informed opinion.
Certainly. Well, at its core, this decision did not change any of the consent requirements that are at issue with respect to TCPA compliance. What it did do was expand upon the language that the Commission has used previously to interpret the term autodialer. and quite frankly inject a lot of new confusion among parties trying to comply. And I think the bottom line, regardless of the industry sector, but certainly for parties engaging in collection, is that to the extent you may have been engaging in calls without prior express consent, I think it's time to take a fresh look at your compliance strategy for those calls, both with respect to consent mechanisms, the technology options available, the FCC's language and potential new arguments available for compliance. Now, some are good, some are bad. And I think more broadly, the strategic factors that go into potential risk exposure in this area, because you certainly need to balance risks not just related to the TCPA, but also risks from other legal sources. FDCPA. I know a number of parties are trying to comply and keep accurate records, and so all of those things are every bit as important here. So this is not a singular dialer question. It's a broader strategic compliance question that this order, I think, encourages parties to take a fresh look at what they are doing. If you haven't reviewed your practices in several years, this is now the time to do it.
Perfect. Peter, I'm going to ask you to be ready to do your section, and I'm going to move the slide deck forward one.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for the summary of recent events, Mark. I found that very interesting and helpful to bake it into layman's terms, so thank you again. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists and to all of you participating who have committed the time to join our discussion today. I'm very pleased and excited to be invited to talk about mobile strategies in today's ARM industry. The mobile world is by far one of my most favorite things to talk about. It gets me excited and keeps me engaged because I feel that you would be hard-pressed to find anything else that changes so rapidly and has become such a large part of American culture than mobile devices and mobile technology. Mike Vesper, do you remember your first cellular phone?
Yes, Peter, I do. It was a nice Panasonic bag phone about the size of a phone book.
Well, I remember my first cell phone too, and it really wasn't that long ago, maybe 1995 or 1996. It was a Nokia brick phone. It was issued to me by my company, my employer at the time, and it could send and receive phone calls, and I could play Snake while waiting on a plane at the airport. That was about the limit of its functionality. And then I remember the Motorola devices that allowed you to talk to others in the same business plan or family plan, like a two-way radio. And I remember thinking how cool that was. And the fact that the phone's now folded to protect the screen was pretty ingenious. Obviously, it didn't take much to impress me back then. But then the technology started to get really interesting. Text messaging and SIM cards started to emerge. I remember traveling internationally, cracking open the back of a phone when the plane landed and changing SIM cards depending on what country I was in. I also carried extra batteries in my briefcase because custom ringtones, texting, photos, custom skins, expanded address books used to just eat up my batteries. And I was really aggravated with that at the time because all I really wanted was a cell phone to send and receive calls. I didn't want or need all that other stuff. Well, now we have these smartphones with fully integrated batteries that can be optimized to last for days or weeks. They carry an array of applications that allow a user to do everything from monitoring your heart rate to monitoring your home security system or monitoring the fuel efficiency of your driving style. Now I find myself at the airport on FaceTime or Skyping with my son or watching Game of Thrones in HD on my iPhone. Oh, and of course, at least for now, these devices can still send and receive phone calls as well. But these phenomenal technological advances over the years have thrust mobile devices right in the center of American culture. Everyone seems to have some kind of mobile device. My parents, who are in their 70s, still carry the old flip phone phones. My 13-year-old son carries a smartphone, And even my 6-year-old nephew carries a disposable burner phone that his parents have given him for emergencies. Each of these technology platforms can provide different insights in the world of big data. Mark Brennan, do you see both old and new devices still out there in your circles?
I definitely do. I see, on the one hand, individuals that are connected 24/7 with any number of social media applications on their devices, and this sort of seamless connectivity across mobile devices, and not even just a phone at this point. And then I also see, on the other hand, people that are that just get excited at the thought of being able to play the old Snake game on a color screen.
I've seen the same. And I really feel that flavors of all these mobile devices, both old and new, can be found in the pockets and purses of every American consumer. I think the younger generations may not even understand the concept of a wireline in a few more years, or the concept of the family phone in your kitchen with the extra long cord to wander around while you talked. I believe that the last CDC poll I read, I saw in late 2013, indicated that 41% of U.S. households were mobile only. And a different poll conducted by Pew in late 2014 estimated that 90% of U.S. adults had a mobile device and 64% of them have a smartphone. And this is important because these smartphones support multiple communication methods based on a consumer's preference. Many of these devices enable things like FaceTime and voice-to-text capabilities. Some consumers prefer internet-based communications on their mobile device, like Skype and email. And there are even now some smartphone apps that enable phone calls over Wi-Fi instead of the carrier's network. And this type of emerging consumer behavior and technology is changing the insights available in big data for the ARM industry. Which kind of brings me to the challenges of mobile strategies in the ARM space. Many people I talk to in our industry about mobile phones get hung up on the TCPA. And I can't emphasize enough that if you take one thing away from today's discussion, it's that our mobile strategies should not simply be driven by regulations, but by the changing technology and the changing consumer behavior as well. What I find most interesting is whether you have express consent or not, the innovation in mobile strategies and the innovations in data insights that spawn from necessity can be beneficial to every organization's consumer contact strategy. At TransUnion, we feel we're in a unique position. Our broad customer base provides us perspective on how many different businesses approach the wireless phone subset of their inventories. And so I'm pleased to talk to the group today about some of the best practices we see, starting with the most fundamental. And the most fundamental is your line type identification. All organizations today use data providers to identify the current line type of a phone number in their inventory. But prior to the application of the TCPA to debt collections, very few firms paid attention to the line types building into their daily campaigns beyond maybe a home and a place of employment indicator. Some organizations also identified known third-party numbers, such as relatives or references that might have appeared on an original application, but that was about it. Then collections fell under the TCPA, and I was working in the agency business at the time, and I remember thinking, how on earth am I going to know if a phone number is a cell phone? And after a long search, I found a provider who was very expensive at the time, and I'll never forget analyzing my first return file. Like 60% of the phones in my inventory came back unknown from this scrub, which wasn't really that uncommon back then. Because you see, data providers were cobbling information together in an attempt to serve the new needs of the industry. But databases were very siloed, and the data associated with profiles was very limited. Nowadays, unknown line types in a return file run less than 2%. Cell identification solutions are affordable, and they're second nature to industry strategists. More importantly, as the technology has developed, the insights available have become more complete. The breadth and the depth of consumer insights has grown exponentially, and the data points associated with a profile have grown as well. A consumer profile that may have been limited to a handful of data attributes 10 years ago can have several dozen data attributes today based on the type of the device, its capabilities, and the consumer's communication preferences. Standard cell identification solutions today include wireless, wireline, VoIP, and ported numbers with a very high degree of accuracy and coverage. Some of the most progressive organizations that I see are diving deep into additional attributes at the consumer level to identify potential opportunity to enhance their contact strategies. Another fundamental concept in best practices that we see is the time of day for outbound attempts. Simply identifying cellular numbers just doesn't seem to be enough these days. The very nature of a cellular device is that it travels with the consumer. And as we continue to emerge from the recession, a greater percentage of consumers have been forced to geographically relocate for employment and consolidate extended families under one household. In most cases, consumers do not change their mobile number based on geography, which creates a unique challenge for outbound contact centers with time of day restrictions. Using my own personal story as an example, my mobile number is a 702 area code in Nevada, but I live in South Florida with a 3-hour time difference. A telephone call to my mobile at 7 p.m. Pacific is an attempt to communicate with me at 10 p.m. Eastern. We see many organizations that have developed address and area code mismatch processes that identify exceptions between the area code and the address on file to exclude those higher risk numbers from campaigns. We've also seen a little bit different approach to manage this risk. Some organizations choose to only dial cellular numbers between 8 a.m. Pacific and 9 p.m. Eastern to ensure that in all instances, all U.S. time zones are open. These companies feel that it's a better approach as the address on file in an area code mismatch process may not be current. I recommend analyzing your mobile RPC rates by hour to determine what's appropriate for your organization and try to leverage your data providers on address updates as you see fit. The next fundamental concept I want to talk about is the attempt counters to wireless numbers. Attempts to mobile numbers intraday is an important part of a strategy, but it's also important to be mindful of how much effort is being applied to the cellular numbers over the collection's life cycle. Manually dialing mobile numbers is a very expensive endeavor. Establishing business rules in your strategy for the frequency of attempts and the maximum number of attempts can help maximize the efficiency of salaries being assigned to that manual dialing effort. The business rules seem to vary widely. Some organizations we see build strategies for monthly or bi-monthly attempt frequency to their mobile inventory. Others build strategies for daily, every other day, or weekly penetration of their wireless inventory. I've seen these decisions for frequency based on recovery or propensity to pay scores. I've seen decisions made on previously contacted or never contacted accounts, which is an interesting way to look at the world. And I've also seen these decisions for frequency made on whether an account has another point of contact that may not be a wireless number. For example, if the only phone number is a mobile number, the frequency of your attempts may be more often than an account that has a mobile and possible wire lines for point of contact as well. In addition to these three fundamental practices, which have been around for a while, we also see some fairly progressive ideas emerge as it relates to making better decisions in the approach to the mobile inventory. Some of these emerging insights on wireless consumers, as I mentioned before, the data attributes available for a consumer have grown exponentially over the years, and they're continuing to expand. We see organizations ingesting more and more data associated with consumers to gain additional insights that help prioritize one phone number over another phone number. Insights like a wireless plan carrier name, billing name or subscriber name and address, length of residence, additional household members, type of device, length of service, are all potentially valuable data points in predicting the contactability of a consumer on their wireless device. Some of these data elements provide insight into a consumer's communication preference and also consumer behavior to assist in establishing that contact. Much of the information is fairly new, and understanding the attributes or understanding the combination of attributes is, as I said, emerging, but I encourage all of the organizations participating with us today to engage their data provider network in forward-thinking discussions and testing to analyze the value to your business. The final emerging practice that I want to talk about a little bit to wrap it up is not specific per se to the mobile phone numbers, but it is nonetheless really interesting, and that is the decisioning of a wrong party contact. When a call results in a wrong party contact, the call center agent is trained to make a real-time decision to remove the phone number from the database or not. That phone number is then stored in what we will call a quote-unquote bad phone database to prevent continued calls to a wrong party. In our current age of compliance, every organization seems to be more and more sensitive than ever to wrong party contacts, and the number of phones in these bad phone databases is growing at a more rapid rate in what is now a more conservative environment. In some cases, the consumer's actual correct contact number is erroneously added to this bad number database. This creates a unique issue to the industry. When batch skip tracing, organizations provide these already known bad numbers to their data providers to dedupe new possible phones against. Therefore, a data provider may be returning a less probable number for the consumer, really creating more risk of wrong party contact rather than mitigating it. Many organizations we see are making efforts to identify good points of contact in their databases of bad phones and reactivate them. And some of the even more progressive behavior that we see is some organizations are thinking of creative ways to proactively manage their risk in real-time decisioning by creating processes and tools that empower their frontline agents to make smarter decisions at the conclusion of a call. You know, I hope some of these best practices will help spur creative discussions within your organizations, with your clients, and with your data providers. Before Michael talks to us about the role of documentation and technology, do we have any questions at this point?
I have a couple if you are ready for them.
I'm ready, sir.
Oh, great. Okay. What is your thought on when we make an attempt to contact a consumer and we then put the account in our no-call queue, a new account comes in with the same number and it's reassigned to our new account queue? Can we make that attempt to contact that consumer again?
You know, I obviously am not a lawyer and can't offer legal advice, but in my professional career opinion, no. I believe that multiple accounts under the house of one collection agency, it is the burden of the service provider to be able to tie all of that together.
Perfect. Mark, again, you're not offering legal advice, but you do dress like an attorney sometimes. So do you have anything that you want to throw into that question that Peter just answered?
Thanks. I think briefly, this could potentially raise compliance challenges under the new decision on the reassigned numbers issue. The commission did not, as far as I can recall, create any distinction between callers that might have multiple accounts to call over. You know, consumers that have multiple accounts with the same caller, there instead appears to be the one free call or one free attempt from a specific caller to a specific consumer at the reassigned number. So to the extent the reassigned number issue is in play, I think I would be cautious about placing more than one call to the same telephone number once you've identified it as a potentially reassigned number.
Perfect. And then the other one that I'll throw out just for right now is sort of does the first call go from when the ruling went into effect? I think they're wondering if they now have, if they can make one more bad call, maybe in a sense, not bad call, but if they can. I'm going to stop trying to explain that question and see what you guys say first.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Mark on that one because I'm not well versed in the ruling that just came out on Friday. So Mark, would you mind handling that one?
No problem. Because this was structured as a declaratory ruling on the reassigned numbers issue, it is effectively the FCC clarifying the law as it has always been. As a result, to the extent there might have been one call placed to a reassigned number before the order should not be read, in my view, to give a second or new one free call after last Friday. On the flip side, for any calls that have already been made, to the extent you may have had a one-time inadvertent call to a reassigned number, it would appear that those calls to reassigned numbers for that first call would continue to be protected under this order. In other words, there's nothing in the order that creates a distinction between the one call to reassigned numbers that may have been made in the last few years versus going forward. So that's actually a very helpful piece of the clarification. So let me just sort of restate that again to make sure everybody's understanding. Anybody that may have placed a call to a reassigned number over the past few years, subject to the statute of limitations on the lawsuits over the TCPA, this order could be used to protect against liability for that first call. There are certain parameters and conditions and so forth that need to be carried through from the order, but the timing for that does apply to calls already made and can do so in a helpful way.
Perfect. All right. Michael Vesper, are you ready to talk with us?
I am ready.
Terrific. I'm going to advance the slide, and why don't you take us away, please?
Great. Thank you, Michael. I've been working in the contact center industry for more than 20 years and solely in the financial services industry for the past 15. During that time, I've seen a lot of changes, both positive and negative, within the industry. Some of the positives, oddly enough, have come out of legislation. Specifically, legislation has forced the bad apples to change their ways or close their doors. The negatives, especially of recent days, include the recent ruling that is unclear how to best leverage certain technology. For our industry, the technology is not about dialing thousands and thousands of numbers and harassing people. It's about providing efficient technology that can communicate a message to the intended recipient using different types of communication methods to help resolve financial obligations. In dealing with many different types of agencies, from the Department of Education clients, credit card issuers, leasing issuers, and medical service providers, just to mention a few, I've observed a common theme in the approach and the dialogue used in the attempt to resolve financial obligations, and that is one of respect and common benefit to all parties. Legislation that prevents communication is doomed for failure. With some uncertainty on how to proceed with your contact management strategies, it's more important than ever to have well-documented processes on how you manage, execute, and audit your strategies. The challenge we have as a technology provider is to provide TCPA-compliant solutions when the rules are vague, at times contradict one another, and in many cases do not apply directly to our industry. However, that doesn't mean we can ignore the requirements. What we have to do is find ways to provide efficient, effective solutions while interpreting the legislation the best we can. I'm not an attorney, and I can't provide any legal advice in regards to TCPA compliance. However, I can provide some best practice guidelines to help you and put your agency in a position to more effectively defend your contact strategies and methodologies if challenged. First, we need to proactively create complete operational documentation to manage, execute, and audit our strategies. You all have to manage large amounts of data typically provided to you by your clients, and unless you are operating in the 1980s, we've abandoned our boxes of index cards and rotary phones. For a slew of other compliance reasons, such as call recording, voice analytics, call tracking, to monitor our call attempts, all which are mandated by your clients and their internal compliance departments, you need to continue to utilize computerized contact management platforms. Some of the items that I'm about to mention are likely some things that you have already implemented at your organization. That's okay. This stuff isn't rocket science, but it's the common sense things that can sometimes go unnoticed. First, create an operational document outlining the various strategies that you utilize for contacting debtors. Within the document, include the technical aspects and/or the solution to support your strategy. Include the strategy for both landline and mobile phone communication. The accepted contact management methods and strategies accepted for different phone types can be significantly different. Create a contact event documentation model. For example, include a consent to call flag at the time of contact. Track date and time of when or if consent changes. Store the phone number type known at the time of contact. Track the method of contact. And if a message is left, track which message was used. Include all of your contact management methods, for example, manual calling, silent voicemail drops, etc. Document the service you utilize for mobile phone identification prior to including into your production strategy. Include the detail of the contact center solution or messaging technology utilized and why you consider it to be a compliant solution based on the legislation in effect at the time contact was initiated. You should include human-initiated contact strategies as much as possible. Be sure to have date and timestamps on each phase of the process. If using a message dropping service like Dial Connections Mobile Direct, be sure the audio file that was played is documented. Include diagrams of your technology that will help clarify and clearly illustrate the solution. It is important that you define and document your organization's quality assurance process, which ideally will proactively monitor and improve the customer service experience during the collection process. Document your data scrubbing services used to improve the quality of your data and help avoid wrong number or wrong party contacts. We are only as good as our data, and the data is pretty darn good these days thanks to the many services offered by companies like TransUnion. But you have to use these services in order to get the benefit. Track dates that each strategy and process change are put into production. Lastly, get certified. There are a number of organizations that provide certification services to assist you in navigating the complex process of the various certifications out there. The next area I'd like to discuss is the data, post-call data process documentation. First, create an operational document that outlines the workflow, data flow, and data storage. Keep your data available and accessible. If you are questioned on a communication to a debtor, be able to reproduce this information with all the facts, how the number was contacted, when it was contacted, and who was the intended party. Store all call records and call attempts with phone number type at the time of contact. There are a multitude of call attempt rules throughout the country. You need to easily maintain and access this information when required. Call recording. Ensure you are recording all your calls, and ensure all of your call recordings are encrypted at the time of recording as well as during the transport to your data center. When moved to a long-term storage location, such as a NAS device, ensure the files are stored on an encrypted volume. While we are all quite focused on the TCPA rulings, let's not forget other compliance standards such as PCI certification for your solutions. So, for all your call recordings, employ a call redaction service to automatically remove sensitive information in a timely fashion. Voice analytics. Employ a voice analytics solution that will automate the QA process by identifying specific recordings containing specific words and phrases, such as a consumer rescinding or giving consent to contact. And lastly, review post-call data processes for all numbers marked as wrong numbers. To summarize, manage your risk accordingly. The more operational documentation that you create, the more operational transparency you have. And the more automated data aggregation processes you have implemented, the easier it is to produce the critical data when needed to support your contact center. I'd like to thank Mark and Peter for their invaluable contributions to our session today, Mike and the team at Inside Arm for all their hard work on this session, and most importantly, thanks to everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to join today. And if anybody has any questions, feel free.
I've got one here. Oh, I didn't mean to talk over you, but I've got a question for you. I'm so excited to give it to you. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So what about technologies that drop a voicemail in the background without hitting the carrier network? If it doesn't dial, it drops a message on the server. Can you talk more about that?
Well, the call is actually never ringing the person's phone. It's being delivered to the carrier, and the carrier is delivering it to voicemail. So, you know, there's discussion about, you know, if it's a call, if it's not a call. From our perspective, that's doesn't fall under the ATDS definition, primarily because it's not dialing a phone. It's leaving a message. The person's phone never rings, and they get a voicemail. It's a no cost, and it's not a nuisance call, which a lot of the regulation is fueled by. It seems that's their main focus, is that there's a nuisance of people calling them, and this is a no nuisance silent delivery of a message. And from our interpretation of the legislation as it exists today, it's not a phone call. Therefore, you know, again, I'm not a lawyer, but from our perspective, it seems to be you know, relatively clear for this ruling.
Perfect. Does anybody else want to jump on and add any more to what Michael just said, or should I move on to some more of the questions here in our queue? I'm going to take that silence to be, let's go on with some more questions. So how does this FCC ruling affect the mobile comply function of the dialer itself? Who would like to try that one first?
This is Michael. I can address that. So the mobile compliance solution is designed specifically to not be an ATDS, and from the definition provided by the FCC, even as they have made it more vague in the latest ruling, that product has an human-initiated factor. It's not being automatically dialed. It's not storing numbers. It's not generating numbers. So from our perspective, again, we see that it's let's face it, everything is always up for a challenge, but we feel that it still remains compliant. Again, from our interpretation of the law, and I think we're okay at this point. As with anything, I think it's always important that everybody evaluates with their own internal compliance department, evaluates a solution, and makes their own decision. But from our perspective, that's what we're trying to provide. Is we're trying to work around these things to provide efficient solutions for our consumers outside of going back to dialing on rotary phones.
And just to be clear for the people, the mobile compliance, that's a dial connection solution, right?
That is, yes, that is.
Okay, perfect.
And Michael, this is Peter. Just curiosity, does that mobile compliance solution of yours still let someone see all of the inbound, outbound activity that's going on, whether it be manually dialed or predictably dialed?
It allows, well, the way it's designed is we've separated the technology. So, for example, if a call is predictably dialed, because we support that type of dialing as well, but it's done on different equipment. So we separate our mobile comply initiated accounts are dialed on different media servers, and the predictive dialing campaigns or any other type of what we consider more of an automated campaign would be done on different equipment. So, and you do have visibility for both.
Oh, cool.
All right. How often do you recommend organizations use a third-party data company to verify phone ownership?
Who would like to take that one? I mean,
Yeah, say that again, Pavel?
Sure. How often do you recommend organizations use a third-party data company to verify phone ownership?
Well, from my opinion would be, I would be scrubbing all of my records before I loaded them into a campaign to make sure that the person that I have consent from is the individual that's still a subscriber to the plan. Because my understanding is you are entering a higher risk environment if you make a telephone call and they might have changed subscriber yesterday.
Sure. But what do you think about the idea of every 14 days is just sort of a healthy, sort of like taking your multivitamin at breakfast every 14 days you should do?
It doesn't sound to me like that would mitigate your risk.
All right. Anyone else want to throw in any? Terrific. Oh, go ahead.
Mark, I think this one, it probably requires some further thinking and analysis, and there's some other factors here because we're trying to react to that question in a vacuum, but there are a lot of things that could affect how you want to approach that. I agree with what was said on. I just want to mention that I think there could be other scenarios that would. There are a lot of different flavors of how you'd want to approach this one, and I'll also sort of chime in on the questions earlier. I mean, the questions earlier were a bit pointed for me to be able to opine with respect to legal issues, but I do think this is a reminder that there's a lot of focus right now based on the FCC decision on the auto dialer aspects, but it's important to keep in mind that that's just one component of a multifaceted compliance solution. So anybody that's getting sort of single-mindedly focused on that piece, there are more pieces to the puzzle to avoiding litigation and mitigating your risk here.
Sure. So this is based on the what the FCC just published. Is it your does the panel have a sense, must you honor customer opt-out requests for non-marketing pre-recorded calls to residents' numbers?
Non-marketing pre-recorded calls to residents' numbers.
There's a little bit, it's a sense prior to the 710 ruling, consent for these was not required if the call was not commercial, or was commercial but contained no solicitation.
And the decision did not impose any new rules and did not extend the consent or consent revocation requirements to new types of calls. And I may need to say comma as far as I can recall, but not in this instance anyway. So under the TCPA, non-marketing calls to landline or residential phones are not restricted. They're not subject to the prior express consent requirements. As a result, there's not any move in the meter of whether consent is required for those calls or whether consent can be revoked as a result. So there's no change there for the calls to landlines. The only caveat to keep in mind is that it is a non-marketing marketing distinction. So if for some reason there was some marketing involved in the call, that could change the compliance approach. A pure debt collection call would not trigger the marketing issues.
Good to know. So you talked about landlines ported to cell phones, but does the opposite hold true as well if a cell phone is ported to a landline? Does that change anything?
Under the TCPA, you would typically have any prior express consent that you would have obtained for a call to a wireless number in most instances would have been as broad, if not more broad than needed, to place the same calls to a landline number. And as a result, it's typically not an issue or a concern. And the FCC recognized this situation in the decision. The other thing is if you are placing auto-dialed calls, that is only restricted when calling wireless numbers. Auto-dialed calls to landlines are not restricted.
All right. With a business associate agreement, does a person's consent to the original creditor, for example, a hospital, transfer to the collection agency? The debts are not being sold. If you're giving that prior express consent.
That one's probably a bit specific for me to be able to answer cleanly on this call, but I'm happy to discuss with anyone separately.
My understanding from some of the reporting that we've done at Inside ARM is that one of the things you want to look at is that the agreement that we'll just go with hospital since that was in the question, but really for any credit application, you want to look at that language to make sure that it explicitly says that. It goes back to that least sophisticated consumer caveat. And so you want to make sure that whomever you're working for has language that says business associates can use this. That's one thing you want to keep in mind. But to Mark's point, you probably want to get your own legal counsel then on this. Most of the dialing resources available today all have some sort of a clicker feature which adds the human intervention. So what is the thought on using these types of resources as being TCPA friendly?
This is Mark. I think each solution now warrants an independent analysis based on the detailed language of these decisions. So that's where, you know, even to group types of technologies together may not be as easy as it used to be. So at the risk of sounding like I'm ducking that one, I think it really is more of a case-by-case analysis and something where it's important to take each technology on its own merits and look at the order and compare that way. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't mean to jump on you there. Thought you were done. just to chime in a little bit on that, I know one of the things that we've tried to do with Dial Connection is that separation of data and technology, and the way that we've implemented that process is to have your data remain on your site or in your data center prior to initiation. So essentially, there's no uploading of a file, there's no sending of a text file, so there's no storage of the data externally. So it all lives right in your data center until it's initiated. So we've tried to increase, again, trying to create that defendable position for our clients, that separation of the technology, of the data, and the storing, really focusing in on that storing of information on the telephony platform. Add a little color to that.
Perfect. I'm gonna throw this to, I think, Peter first, just because this is more of maybe a best operations practices question. But if a consumer revokes consent to a text message via a replied text, do you think a company should just all communication across the board should cease? Is that how you would advise if you were to advise that person?
Yeah, I mean, as a career operator, I would say that qualifies as revocation. So I would handle that just like they were standing in front of me and revoking their consent in that fashion.
Perfect.
Yeah, this is Mark. I think this is one of the scenarios that pop up in light of the order in which it's the circumstances, the specific circumstances become very relevant, and not only the consumer's expectation, but also the context of the consent that was given in the first place. So in this type of situation, I think based on the order, you'd want to look at what consent was provided in the first place. What was the consumer told would happen if they hit stop or quit or whatever the keyword is by text? Were they told that they would stop receiving just a certain campaign question? Or, I think this often has different flavors on the marketing side. But if somebody signs up for a specific coupon program or something like that, then maybe a company like that has more arguments that they've only opted out of that particular program or campaign. And you'd have to look at the disclosures. You'd have to look at what was presented to the consumer and what the organization told the consumer would happen if they revoked their consent this way. At the same time, you have to look at the order, which in many ways seeks to make it relatively easy for consumers to revoke their consent. So I think when you have a consumer that is reaching out to you and it fundamentally saying, I don't want to hear from you on X, well, then it definitely should be considered to apply across platforms. But again, the context may matter. So just be very careful here because you're dealing with someone who has, in fact, expressed some preference to you on this issue.
How do you handle true ownership when a family plan is shared? As an operations guy, Peter.
Yeah, you're not going to, you're going to be challenged in trying to do that because obviously with a family plan, there is a single name on the bill. Like my family plan. It's my name on the bill, but my wife is on it, my son's on it as well. So you're not going to be able to see any differentiation between my wife and my son versus I. At least nothing that I'm aware of out there in the industry yet. Probably in the near future, some data provider is going to figure out how to do that. But as it stands right now, I'm not aware of any solutions that allow you to see that extra layer of visibility.
Perfect. What consideration should agencies take into account when running an omni-channel contact strategy, letters, email, dialer, text simultaneously?
What considerations should they take?
Sort of policies and procedures that need to be created to ensure compliance.
Yeah, when you're running multiple concurrent strategies like that, the biggest thing that I would recommend is make sure that your workflow is very clearly documented and including the decisions that you make of why you're choosing to treat someone through a particular channel. The one thing as a consumer that I can speak to is it's pretty frustrating to a guy like me when I just talked to my issuer yesterday via text, and then I'm getting a telephone call on the same topic from them today. So I would just be cautious of the timing of those multiple communication channels, and that's where blowing it out on paper and documenting your workflow would be my recommendation.
All right. Do we have any other, does anybody want to add on to that before, because we're just about out of time and I want to do our talk off. Any other final thoughts? All right. So once again, I want to thank all of you for spending this afternoon with us. We very much appreciate your participation. I also want to thank today's panelists, Mark Brennan of Hogan Lovells, Peter Gazzelli of TransUnion, and Michael Vesper of Dial Connection. If you have questions about the content in today's presentation, you can send those to editor@insidearm.com, and I will make sure that it's ferried to the appropriate responder. And if you have a question that wasn't answered today in the webinar, the Q&A, you can ask it as part of the survey that I hope you'll all take as you exit this webinar. Or again, you can send those to editor. We'll do our best to get you the answers you'd like. It is, what is today? Today is Wednesday, July 15th, 2015. And with that, we're off. Thank you all very much, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.